There's always been a tradition on the left to run candidates in presidential elections and also in local elections in order to use the occasion of an election to reach a broad public. You have a much bigger chance of reaching a broad public in an election cycle than you have in a non-election cycle. So there's always a value to that. And I would certainly counsel everybody to participate in that process who's willing who's willing to invest the time and resources to it. Now, if the question is whether I think they have a, so to speak, snowball's chance in hell of winning, that's an altogether separate question. In my opinion, no. And this is not to pour cold water on anybody, but in my opinion, no, for a very simple reason. There were two factors that, as it were, enabled Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. Factor number one was his, if you want to call it, his class struggle platform. It was fundamentally about redistributing the wealth and also simultaneously improving the lives of ordinary people. And he eventually came up with a set of planks, Green New Deal, abolish student debt, abolish student tuition, Medicare for all. He came up with several planks which reached a very broad audience, which resonated for probably the majority of the American people, and maybe even a supermajority of the American people. But that was one factor. The other factor is more, so to speak, nebulous, and that was in a American situation where people are so cynical about politics. Bernie had a half-century track record, actually more than a half-century track record, and so he became credible because he was consistent. They used to say about during when Bernie first went out in the campaign trail in 2016, people would roll their eyes and say, "Oh, Bernie, he's been saying the same thing since the 1960s." And in fact, that was his selling point, that he wasn't trimming his sails or tacking in order to get a favorable outcome. He had stood fairly firm in his beliefs, and the American people were now ready for those beliefs. Bernie was an unusual case because it wasn't the candidate who rose to the times. It was actually the reverse. The times rose to Bernie. Bernie stood still for about 60 years, but our economy did not stand still. Beginning in the 1980s, there's what's called a long stagnation in wages, such that nowadays about 80% of the population are doing worse than their parents did. So he had the advantage of that long track record, which resonated for people otherwise cynical about the political process. The same just can't be said of Marianne Williams and Robert Kennedy Jr. I'm not going to pass judgment on their specific platforms as well as the statements they have made in the last couple of months. Setting that aside for the moment, as I said, that second factor of consistency, which then produced credibility, or credibility born of consistency. If he didn't have that, I don't think he had a chance. So the fact that Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. don't have that consistency and thence credibility, I don't see any possibility whatsoever. But that being said, As I initially pointed out, it's always been a staple of the left to use the election cycle to um, send your message, to transmit your message, to broadcast your message. And certainly that's a valuable thing to do. I wish more people on the left would do the same thing, take advantage of the election cycle. I wish more credible candidates would enter on the Democratic side. I think Joe Biden is a disaster waiting to happen. People forget that Donald Trump would have easily won in 2020 if it wasn't for that colossal self inflicted wound called COVID. If he
Yep.
hadn't carried on in such a crazy way during the COVID crisis, and then simultaneous was the crash in the economy. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, people in politics shouldn't indulge in ifs because you never know. But this was really just a fluke. COVID was a fluke. Had it not been for COVID, Trump would have trounced Bernie in the debates. You know, Bernie came up with some nicknames, some of which were not very successful, like Crazy Bernie. I should say Trump came up with some nicknames, some of which were not very successful. They didn't stick, such as Crazy Bernie. Well, Bernie was plainly not crazy, you know. But a couple did stick. Pocahontas stuck, and Sleepy Joe stuck. And it's going to stick again in this election title. I don't even think you should call him Sleepy Joe anymore. You should call him Comatose Joe. Um, and I think it's a disaster waiting to happen. And the way the Democrats are currently going about it, thinking that you're going to somehow knock Trump out with all of these scandals, is just so ridiculous. If that's your best, if that's the best you can put forth, that you think by indicting him on this and indicting him on that, I mean, as many people have said, Trump has a long history with these scandals. They didn't affect his electoral prospects before. They're not going to affect them now.